Hey guys, tonight we're opening the curtain on one of the strangest and most haunting legends in all of Greek mythology, the Amazons. You've heard the whispers, a nation of women who needed no men, who lived by the bow, who raised their daughters to ride horses into battle, and their sons to be forgotten. To the Greeks, they were terrifying, almost unthinkable. And yet, here they are, living rent-free in bedtime stories told for thousands of years, caught somewhere between myth and memory. Picture this: the dust of Troy still hangs in the air, screams fading into smoke, and there she is, Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. She charges into the fray, armor gleaming, eyes blazing with that last desperate fire of someone who knows her fate but chooses it anyway. And waiting for her is Achilles, the man no mortal can touch, the man already drowning in his own grief and rage. In a heartbeat, her spear nearly finds him, but in the next, he buries his blade in her chest. And in that instant, Achilles looks into her dying eyes and feels something he has never felt before. Love, desire, regret, a lifetime of it, compressed into a single stolen breath. That's the hook, isn't it? The greatest warrior of all time, undone not by a weapon, but by the face of the woman he killed. The Amazons weren't just a myth the Greeks told their children. They were a mirror, reflecting everything men feared and secretly craved: freedom, power, and women who didn't play by the rules. And tonight, we're going to peel back those layers: myth, propaganda, and even archaeology. We'll wander from Homer's verses to Scythian graves where real warrior women were laid to rest with their bows. This isn't just a bedtime story. It's a dark lullaby about power, fear, and resilience, and it has echoed through history all the way to our own time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Greeks had a word for the Amazons long before they ever bothered to describe them. They called them anti-aneirai, literally. The women who stand against men, not side by side, not with, against. That tells you almost everything you need to know about how the Greeks saw them not as neighbours, not as fellow humans, but as a threat to the natural order. Imagine living in a society where the city-state was built on rules, hierarchy, and the control of women's roles, and then hearing rumours of a people who had burned those rules to ash. Athens, Sparta. Thebes each had its laws that tied women to hearth and household. Women in Athens couldn't vote, couldn't own much, couldn't speak in the assembly. Their names were often left out of inscriptions, as though the public sphere might crumble if a female voice dared enter it. And yet, in the songs and stories sung around fires at night, they whispered about the Amazons' women who needed no men, who hunted, fought, ruled, and lived by their own laws. The mere idea carried the weight of a nightmare. Why? Because the Amazons weren't just enemies on a battlefield, they were enemies of the imagination. They were living proof that the world could be otherwise, and to men whose entire authority rested on the certainty that women were weak, obedient, and domestic, that was the scariest bedtime story of all. Think about the psychology of fear. People rarely dread what's impossible. Nobody has nightmares about pink elephants. We have nightmares about the neighbour who might be watching, the colleague who might betray us, the rival who could replace us. The Greeks didn't pour their terror into harpies or gorgons alone. Those were beasts, easily dismissed as fantasy. But Amazons, they looked too human, too plausible. In Homer's Iliad, they're called equal to men. That phrase drips with anxiety. If men are supposed to be superior, then a race of women equal or worse better upends the whole hierarchy. And the Greeks couldn't just let that go. They needed to contain it, to weave the fear into stories where the Amazons always, inevitably, lost. Picture an Athenian child tucked into bed, a father telling him the tale of Heracles stealing the girdle of Hippolyta. The moral is never subtle, yes. There are fierce women out there, dangerous women, but the hero will conquer them. Order will be restored, and tomorrow morning, when that boy sees his mother silent in the courtyard and his sister learning how to weave, the story will feel like a guarantee. The world is as it should be. The monster has been defeated. But here's the irony. The more the Greeks told these stories, the more the Amazons lived in their heads. They painted them on vases, etched them into temple walls, dressed them in Eastern garb to make them exotic and alien. Yet the outlines were familiar around shields, bows, spears, and horses. These weren't creatures of chaos. They were armies, with discipline and skill, like any other. The Greeks could imagine them because they weren't imagining very far. And that's the uncomfortable part. What if the Greeks weren't making this up at all? What if their nightmares were rooted in something real? In neighbours who rode like the wind across the steppe? Even within myth, the tension seeps through. In one story, the Amazons invade Athens itself, marching straight into the city. Think about how that would land in the Athenian psyche. It wasn't just Persia or Sparta they feared, it was women crashing through their gates. The battle, known as the Amazonomachy, was retold again and again, not because it was a minor skirmish, but because it was therapy. To replay the story was to reassure themselves we beat them, we pushed them back, we proved the order still stands. Yet art betrays truth. Look closer at the friezes from the Parthenon or the metopes from the Temple of Apollo. The scenes don't show men effortlessly slicing down women. They show struggle, men bleeding, Amazons pressing forward, locked in duels that could go either way. Some even show the women standing triumphant in mid-motion, spears angled for the kill. These weren't bedtime doodles. These were anxieties carved in marble. And if you lean in close, you can almost hear the whisper beneath the chisel marks. What if they win next time? There's another layer too. For the Greeks, war was male identity. A man without battle scars was barely a man at all. So what did it mean when women bore arms? When women fought as equals? It wasn't just unsettling, it was humiliating. The Amazons weren't simply enemies of men. They were thieves of masculinity. To admit their existence was to admit that the thing men prized most strength was not theirs alone. Imagine an Athenian soldier, limping home from war, haunted not just by Persian arrows but by the idea of a woman warrior who might outmatch him. That would sting far more than losing to another man. And maybe that's why the stories always ended with conquest. Theseus captures Antiope. Heracles tricks Hippolyta. Achilles kills Penthesilea. Again and again, the cycle repeats. Each myth closes the wound, stitches the ego back together, but like any scar, it never fully heals. The myths, in other words, reveal more about the Greeks than about the Amazons. They show us a culture obsessed with control, terrified of alternatives, endlessly rehearsing the same play where men triumph and women bow. But here's the twist. The very act of telling these stories kept the Amazons alive. They meant to erase them, but they immortalized them instead. And that is why we're still here, whispering their names tonight. But what happens when we peel back the myth and look for the Amazons in the soil, in the bones, in the graves left behind? Do we still find monsters, or something far more human? In myth, the Amazons didn't just appear out of the mist. They had a pedigree, a divine ancestry meant to explain their contradictions. The Greeks said they were the daughters of Ares, god of war and harmonia, goddess of harmony. Think about that union for a second, pure violence joined with perfect balance. Chaos and order sleeping in the same bed. No one should be surprised that what came out of it was complicated. Ares was not the kind of god the Greeks loved. They feared him, they tolerated him, but they didn't admire him. He wasn't strategy or cleverness or the noble defense of the polis. He was bloodlust in its rawest form, the screaming madness of the battlefield when reason fled. His temples were sparse, his cult small. Even Zeus, his father, called him hateful. When Ares entered the story, it was usually to embody everything reckless and destructive about war. And yet Harmonia, his unlikely partner, was the goddess of unity, of accord. She was the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, a kind of cosmic apology for their chaotic affair. Harmonia symbolized the balance that could be forged when love and strife found middle ground. She was the goddess who received the cursed necklace that doomed her line, but also represented reconciliation. So when the Greeks told themselves that Amazons were born of Ares and Harmonia, they were really confessing something, that these women were living contradictions, both chaos and order, both terror and symmetry. Close your eyes and imagine the first Amazon stepping out of the shadow of myth. In one hand, the spear of her father, sharp and eager for blood. In the other, the poise of her mother, a dignity that could steady even the wildest storm. To the Greeks, that combination was unbearable. A man who was violent could be dismissed as brutal. A man who was balanced could be admired as wise. But a woman who was both who could embody war and still move with grace, that was a paradox too sharp to accept. And paradox makes the best monsters. It unsettles the mind because it won't sit neatly in one box. You can't call it one thing and feel safe. The Amazons, born of Ares and Harmonia, were the kind of myth that gnawed at the edges of Greek certainty. Maybe that's why the Greeks kept circling back to their origin story, because they were trying to explain the impossible. Stories of their birth varied, of course. Some said they came from the banks of the Thermodon River in Asia Minor, a city of women who had banished men. Others said they were descended directly from the union of Ares and Harmonia, with whole generations springing from that line. Either way, the narrative reinforced the same idea: these women were not like ordinary women. They were marked from the start, forged in the fire of contradiction. But what's fascinating is how much this origin reflects Greek insecurity. Ares alone would have made the Amazons easy to understand, just savage, violent, uncontrollable. Harmonia alone would have made them noble, maybe even admirable. It was the combination that drove the anxiety. It was the thought that women could embody both ferocity and order, that they could fight like men and still maintain dignity, that made them so dangerous in the Greek imagination. Think of it this way: if the Amazons had been painted as wild, chaotic barbarians, the Greeks could have dismissed them the way they dismissed countless tribes. But by giving them a divine mother of harmony, the myth suggested that the Amazons also had structure, rules, a society. They weren't just tearing things down. They were building something alien and unsettling, a civilization led by women, disciplined enough to sustain itself, fierce enough to defend itself. That was the true nightmare. What if it wasn't just savagery that threatened Athens, but an alternative order? The Greeks projected their fears onto the Amazons' origin. Children of war and balance meant that even their violence had a purpose. Even their chaos had direction. And that meant Greek men could never be sure of superiority. Ares could be reckless, but when his daughters rode, they carried Harmonia's steadiness too. They fought not as berserkers, but as regiments. They didn't just kill, they conquered. And maybe that's the detail that stung the most. For all the Greek myths of order triumphing over chaos, Zeus chaining Typhon, Apollo slaying Python, the Amazons refused to fit the script. They weren't chaos threatening to swallow civilization. They were civilization, just one not ruled by men. There's an image carved on a black figure vase, tucked away in a museum case. An Amazon rides a horse, her bow drawn, her shield curved. She looks almost serene, not wild-eyed, not frenzied. Her face is calm, focused, balanced. That's Harmonia's blood in her veins, and in her hands, the weapons of Ares. It's the combination that unsettles you. Think about the psychology. The Greeks lived in a world where categories defined everything: male and female, Greek and barbarian, order and disorder. The Amazons broke those categories. They were both at once. That's why their origin mattered. It was less genealogy than confession. And yet, for all the Greeks' attempts to explain them as paradox, the stories never stopped there. The daughters of Ares and Harmonia weren't just symbols, they were queens, leaders, warriors whose names would echo across battlefields. And their clashes with heroes would expose even deeper cracks in the Greek imagination. The Greeks loved to tell the story of Heracles and the belt of Hippolyta. On the surface, it sounded like another heroic errand. One more labour in the endless list forced on him by King Eurystheus. But beneath the surface, this story held a sting sharper than any Hydra's fang. Because the belt wasn't just an ornament, it was a symbol of Amazonian sovereignty, given to Hippolyta by her father Ares himself. To take it wasn't just theft, it was humiliation, the stripping of a queen's legitimacy. Heracles arrived with his usual blend of arrogance and brute force. But here's where the tale takes a surprising turn. Hippolyta didn't meet him with a spear aimed at his throat. According to some versions, she came forward willingly, even graciously. She asked what he wanted, listened, and agreed to give him the belt, not out of fear, out of recognition, maybe even respect. Picture that moment, a queen of warriors, standing before the most infamous strongman of Greece and choosing diplomacy over slaughter. It could have been a rare flicker of peace between two worlds, but peace doesn't make good myth. Enter Hera, draped in jealousy and venom, watching from Olympus. She disguised herself and whispered through the camp, sowing panic among the Amazons. "Heracles is here to steal your queen," she hissed. "He'll chain her, drag her across the sea, enslave her people." The whispers grew like fire across dry grass. By the time Heracles and Hippolyta stood at the riverbank, warriors were already massing, blades flashing, horses pouring the dirt. The deal was undone before it had begun. And in the smoke of confusion, the moment of trust shattered. Heracles, never one to pause or question, drew his sword and struck Hippolyta down. The queen who might have offered peace fell not because of her enemy's strength, but because of a lie whispered by another woman. And that's the cruelest twist the Amazon undone, not by the brute force of Heracles, but by betrayal born from Olympus itself. It's hard to miss the irony. The story wasn't about male strength overcoming female defiance. It was about suspicion poisoning cooperation. The Greeks couldn't imagine a queen standing equal to their greatest hero. If she offered him the belt, it had to end in blood anyway, because the myth demanded it. The hierarchy had to be preserved. Think about Hippolyta for a moment, not the character frozen on a Val or the footnote in Apollodorus, but as a person. She ruled a people who were feared across the Aegean, who raised daughters to fight, who carved a society on the edge of the known world. She meets Heracles, sees him not as an invader, but as a man with a task, and considers why not to give the belt is not weakness. It is choice, and choice is power, but that subtlety, that grace, was intolerable to the mythmakers. A powerful woman choosing to yield on her own terms threatened to rewrite the entire script. Better to kill her and call it conquest. The vase painters loved this story. You can see it in their brushstrokes, Heracles wrestling with Hippolyta, or her sisters storming in to avenge her. Sometimes the belt is shown gleaming in his hand like a trophy, a symbol of order restored. But the scenes are chaotic, crowded, violent. They don't look like clean victories. They look like ambushes, like a peace turned sour. And here's where the psychology cuts deep. For the Greeks, the story wasn't just entertainment. It was a reassurance that even the strongest Amazon could be deceived, cornered, defeated. The belt, the thing that marked Hippolyta as sovereign, was destined to hang in a Greek treasury, proof that no female order could withstand male force. Yet in telling the story, they also revealed their unease. Why add the detail that Hippolyta agreed at first? Why let that sliver of grace into the narrative at all? Unless, somewhere in their imagination, they recognized her nobility. It's as if the Greeks wanted it both ways, an enemy who could be admired, but one who must always be destroyed. The tragedy is that Hippolyta's end was unnecessary. It wasn't fate that doomed her. It was gossip, rumour, insecurity. Hera didn't swing the sword, but her whispers turned potential alliance into carnage. And isn't that the nature of fear? It doesn't need facts to destroy. It only needs suspicion. Heracles sailed away with the belt, the prize of his 9th labour. The Greeks told the story as proof of his might, another notch in the endless saga of his labours. But listen closely, and the echoes ring differently. The belt wasn't won in a fair contest of strength. It was taken in chaos, forged by manipulation, sealed in blood that didn't have to be spilled. And what of the Amazons left behind? Imagine the camp after the ships departed, the silence after the clash, sisters gathering around their queen's body, horses restless, the air still thick with betrayal. To lose a leader not in glorious battle, but in a confusion sparked by lies that grief cuts deeper than any blade. They would ride again, of course, they always did. But every saddle after that carried the memory of Hippolyta, the queen who tried to choose peace and paid for it with her life. The Greeks never saw it that way. For them, Hippolyta was another monster slain, another labour completed. But for us, listening across the centuries, the story lands differently. It's not about the belt. It's about the fragility of trust, about how easily fear erases choice, about how myths cage women even when they try to act with dignity. And maybe, just maybe, that's why her name still lingers in our mouths. Hippolyta the queen who might have changed the script, if only the chorus of fear had let her. But the Amazons were not finished. Another queen would rise, another story would unfold, And this time the clash would reach the very heart of Athens itself. The Greeks like to say that Antiope, sister of Hippolyta, fell in love with Theseus. But you can already sense the twist when Greeks told stories about women who strayed from their place. The ending was never simple, never kind. Some versions whisper that Theseus captured her in battle, binding her wrists and dragging her back to Athens as a trophy. Others, more charitable, claim she went willingly, abandoning her sisters to be with him. Either way, the myth hinges on possession Antiope leaving the Amazon order and becoming part of the city that prided itself as the very cradle of patriarchy. Picture it, Athens in its early glory, temples rising, laws tightening their grip, men speaking of democracy while excluding half their population from its promises. Into this world comes Antiope, a queen in her own right, now reduced to the role of consort. To the Athenians, she wasn't just a woman, they believed she was proof that even the fiercest Amazon could be domesticated, folded into the order of men. But the story never rests easily. The Amazons came for her. The legends say they marched on Athens, an army of sisters thundering at the gates, demanding their queen back. Imagine the sight: women on horseback, bows drawn, war cries echoing against the marble walls. For a city that defined itself on order, this was chaos incarnate, the nightmare of the myth come alive. The Athenians called it the Amazonomachy, the war against the Amazons. It was painted, carved, sung, rehearsed. On the metops of the Parthenon, you can still see the struggle, frozen in stone Amazons grappling with hoplites, shields clashing, horses rearing. To Athens, it was a story of triumph, order restored, barbarians beaten back, a queen domesticated into the fold. But scratch the marble, and a different story bleeds through. Because if the battle was so decisive, so easy, why did Athens keep retelling it? Think about that. Victories that are certain don't need retelling. You don't carve them into stone, paint them on pots, recite them like prayers. You bury them. Move on. But the Amazonomachy lingered because it wasn't just a memory. It was a wound, reopened every time someone whispered Antiope's name. Some say Antiope fought against her sisters, defending Athens beside Theseus. Others say she switched sides mid-battle, cut down in the chaos, her blood watering the very soil that Athenians later swore was theirs by destiny. Every version is messy. Every version leaves a bitter aftertaste. And that's because the myth wasn't about clarity, it was about control. Antiope represented the possibility that an Amazon could choose something other than her sisters, that she could betray or be betrayed by the order she was born into. For the Greeks, that possibility had to be managed. If she chose Athens, then Athens proved its superiority. If she died, then her fate warned every other Amazon step outside the line, and you will be crushed. But look closer, and you can see the cracks. Why was Antiope remembered at all? Why give her a name, a face, a story? When countless other women in Greek myth were reduced to shadows, because she mattered, because her presence haunted Athens. She was the ghost that reminded them the Amazons had once reached the heart of their city, had once made their men tremble. Imagine standing in the Parthenon centuries later, gazing up at the carved figures of women locked in combat. You'd know what the Athenians were trying to say: we beat them. We always will. But you'd also feel what they feared. They were here once. They could come again. And maybe that's why Antiope's story won't stay quiet, because deep down, it was never about her alone. It was about Athens itself, and the insecurity buried at its foundations. The psychology here is stark. Athens called itself the birthplace of democracy, but democracy meant men debating in the agora while women were silenced at home. The Amazonomachy wasn't just myth, it was propaganda, hammered into art to remind women of their place. Antiope, whether captive or lover, was proof of the message: resist, and you will be dragged back; submit, and you will be absorbed. Either way, you will not stand apart, yet myths slip beyond control. They leak meaning in ways their authors never intend. For all their efforts to frame Antiope as proof of Athens' superiority, her story also testifies to Amazon resilience. The sisters who came for her, the war they waged at the city's walls, the blood spilled in the streets, none of that screams weakness. It screams persistence, defiance, the very traits the Greeks wanted to erase, carved forever into their most sacred temples. And here's the bitterest irony: the Athenians built their Parthenon to honor Athena, a goddess of wisdom and war, born without a mother, sprung from Zeus's skull. They praised a woman warrior as divine, while chipping away at the memory of women warriors who might have been flesh and blood. Antiope stood at that contradiction, a living embodiment of the city's doublethink. Close your eyes and hear it: the clash of hooves against stone, the cries of Amazons at the gate, the echo of arrows whistling past marble columns. This wasn't a bedtime reassurance. This was a collective therapy session, replayed in myth and art until the scar became architecture. And yet, for all the noise, one question lingers: what happens when the Amazons are not the invaders, but the defenders? When they stand on foreign soil, not demanding a sister back, but fighting for survival in a war they didn't start. The war for Troy had already devoured years by the time Penthesilea rode into the story. The Greeks were weary, the Trojans desperate, the gods divided. Corpses piled on the beaches, smoke smeared the horizon, and still the fighting dragged on. Into this ruin came the Amazons, summoned by Priam as a last, desperate gamble. He asked not for another army, but for warriors who carried with them a legend, women whose names could unsettle the Greeks before a single arrow flew. And at their head was Penthesilea, daughter of Ares, queen of the Amazons. She arrived not as a saviour, but as someone already haunted. In some tellings, she had killed her sister by accident in a hunt. The spear meant for a stag-piercing flesh she loved instead. That grief drove her toward Troy, seeking a death that might cleanse her shame. Imagine the weight of that: a warrior queen who led her sisters into the bloodiest war of the age, carrying inside her a wound no victory could heal. The moment she appeared on the battlefield, the story shifted. The Greeks had grown accustomed to fighting men like themselves, Trojan princes, Lycian allies, Phrygian spearmen. But when Penthesilea rode forward, tall in the saddle, her armour flashing, her bow already drawn, the air itself changed. They weren't facing just another enemy. They were facing the nightmare whispered in their myths. The Antionerae, women who fought like men and yet refused to be men. And if the Greeks had mocked the Amazons as fantasies, here was the moment the fantasy drew blood. The clash was brutal. Penthesilea cut down Greek after Greek, her spear never missing, her horses weaving through the melee like shadows. For a moment, the tide turned. Imagine the panic rippling through the Greek ranks as men who had dismissed the Amazons as bedtime stories now watched their comrades fall under the hand of a woman. Her sisters fought beside her, fierce and relentless, a storm of arrows and steel. But every legend meets its counter-legend. Achilles stepped forward, the greatest warrior alive, already stained with Hector's blood, already half dead with grief for Patroclus. He saw Penthesilea, and she saw him, and the battlefield narrowed to a single line. The poets say it was quick, almost too quick. A flash of spear, a clash of shields, the sharp rhythm of blades. Penthesilea drove her spear close to Achilles' heart, but his armour turned it aside. He struck back, his sword carving through the space between them, and in a heartbeat, she fell. The queen who had made the Greeks tremble lay broken in the dust. But here's where the story twists. As Achilles looked down at her body, something shattered inside him. He pulled off her helmet, and there she was, not a monster, not a nightmare, but a woman with a face that bore both fierceness and grief. The man who had never flinched in battle staggered at the sight. Love, desire, pity, whatever it was, hit him too late. A flood that drowned him in the moment of victory. What does it mean when the greatest warrior falls for the woman he just killed? The Greeks never agreed. Some said Achilles was mocked for it, that Thersites, a common soldier, jeered at him for weeping over a dead enemy, and Achilles, humiliated, killed him on the spot. Others said he buried Penthesilea with honours, unable to shake the feeling that her death had stolen something from him that he never knew he needed. But one truth remains: the story is less about triumph than about contradiction. The Amazon queen came to Troy seeking release from her own guilt. She found death, yes, but she also cracked open the armour of Greece's greatest hero. In that single moment, she was both defeated and victorious, because sometimes the most enduring victories are the wounds you leave behind in your enemy. Think of Achilles' psyche, Here was a man defined by rage, by invulnerability, by the endless killing that made him half divine. And yet one look at Penthesileia's face, her humanity, her nobility pierced him deeper than any spear. That isn't a story of male dominance. It's a confession of male fragility, of how even the strongest warrior could be undone by the recognition of another's worth. The Greeks retold the scene again and again, in pottery, in fragments of epic, in whispers passed down through centuries. They wanted to reassure themselves the Amazon died, the order was preserved, Troy still burned. But the image they couldn't shake wasn't her fall. It was Achilles' gaze, the crack in his certainty. And isn't that what makes the story unforgettable? It wasn't just about war. It was about longing, regret, and the cruel timing of emotions. Penthesileia's beauty didn't save her, and Achilles' realization didn't redeem him. The moment existed only as tragedy, as proof that sometimes recognition comes only after destruction. The irony is sharp. The Greeks wanted their myths to celebrate victory, to reassure men of their superiority. But here they carved into their own tradition a scene that undermines the entire premise. A man weeps for the woman he just killed. What does that say about the neat hierarchy they tried so hard to enforce? Maybe the Greeks couldn't erase the Amazons because the Amazons had already infiltrated their imagination, planting seeds of doubt that no victory could uproot. For us, the story lands differently. We see Penthesileia not as a conquered foe, but as a mirror of resilience. She carried guilt, yes, but she turned it into defiance. She rode into the greatest war of her time, not as a victim, but as a queen. And though her body fell, her presence lingers in Achilles' regret, in the art that preserved her, in the very fact that we still speak her name. Imagine the silence after her death, the battlefield still echoing with the clash of weapons, and Achilles standing frozen, staring at her face while the war raged around him. That image is the real belt, the real prize, not the trophy he carried home, but the wound in his heart he could never heal. And that is why Penthesileia endures, because in a world that demanded women be silent, she forced a hero to confront her voice, even if it came in her final breath. But the Amazon's story doesn't end on the plains of Troy. For the Greeks, killing one queen wasn't enough. They had to keep fighting the idea of Amazons, chiseling their fears into temples, retelling battles where the outcome was never as clean as they pretended. And that takes us back to Athens, where art and myth tried to bury the unease that Penthesileia had exposed. The Greeks told themselves the Amazons were myths, bedtime stories to soothe their fragile hierarchies. But Earth has a way of keeping its own records, and centuries after those tales were carved into marble, the soil began whispering another version, not in poetry, not in propaganda, in bones. On the endless steppes north of the Black Sea where wind tears through the grass like an unending sigh, archaeologists dug into burial mounds. The kurgans left behind by Scythian nomads. They expected treasure, horse harnesses, bronze weapons. What they found was stranger. Graves of women. Women buried with swords and quivers, daggers laid across their hips, arrows clutched against their ribs. At first, the discovery felt like a mistake. Surely these were symbolic offerings, tokens to honor wives of warriors. But the bones told a harder truth. Femurs bowed from years on horseback, spines compressed from hours in the saddle, wrists thickened by archery. These weren't wives. These were fighters, real women, trained from childhood to ride and kill. The Amazons weren't fantasies. They were neighbors. And suddenly, the Greek bedtime story stopped being so safe. Imagine the moment a woman's skeleton lifted from the earth, her skull resting beside the iron tip of a spear that once pierced flesh, her teeth worn down by raw meat and smoke, her leg twisted from a horse's kick. She lived. She bled. She rode across the same steppe that still rolls into the horizon today. She wasn't a goddess, and she wasn't a monster. She was a soldier. For decades, historians had argued the Amazons were projections men's nightmares painted into myth. But grave after grave said otherwise. One study found that as many as a third of Scythian female burials contained weapons, and not decorative ones. Arrowheads lodged in ribs, blades worn smooth by years of use, horses sacrificed alongside them, their skulls arranged like guardians in the dirt. These women had fought, and some had died, in battle. What does that do to the Greek myth? it reframes it entirely. The Athenians might have called the Amazons exotic, barbarian, impossible. But here were bones that told the same story the Greeks pretended was fantasy. In other words, the Greeks hadn't invented the Amazons. They had encountered them, and the memory had scared them so badly, they turned it into legend. Think about the psychology of that. The Greeks met stepwomen who rode like men, who fought like men, and rather than admit they'd been matched, they rebranded them as myths half real, half invented, forever defeated in art. It was a way to control the terror, a way to laugh at what had nearly bested them. But the dirt doesn't lie, and the graves don't flatter. The Scythian world was harsh. Winters stretched like punishments, summers burned like furnaces, and the horizon never ended. To survive there meant bending children to horses before they could even walk, teaching them to string bows taller than their bodies, boys and girls alike. There was no luxury of saying, "This is men's work, this is women's." Survival had no patience for categories, and so women learned to fight. Close your eyes and hear it, hooves pounding, arrows whistling, women shouting war cries that echoed across the grasslands. Not myths, not bedtime threats. Real. The kind of real that leaves marks in skeletons. The kind of real you can hold in your hand when you lift a rusted blade from the dirt. The Greeks saw these women, traded with them, clashed with them, and then wrapped them in the silk of story. The Amazonome wasn't just fantasy, it was memory, reshaped. That's why it lingered. You don't carve entire wars into marble unless the fear behind them was once real. And if you doubt that, picture one grave uncovered in southern Russia. A girl, no more than 16, buried with a quiver of arrows, her body showing signs of old battle wounds. 16, a child, yet old enough to have fought, bled, and died. The Greeks might have mocked Amazons as unnatural, but here was the truth life on the steppe demanded it. A girl who couldn't fight was a girl who wouldn't survive, and suddenly, the myth of the Amazons stopped being a fable about unnatural women and started looking like an uncomfortable truth about human resilience. The soil revealed more than weapons, it revealed ritual. Women buried with jewellery beside battle gear, beauty and brutality mingling in the same grave. One had a mirror laid near her face, the polished bronze dulled by centuries, a reminder that even warriors looked at themselves once in a while. The Greeks painted Amazons as wild, masculine, stripped of femininity, but the grave showed something else, women who could braid their hair and sharpen their swords, who could cradle infants and draw blood in the same day. That complexity is what terrified Athens most. They wanted categories: men strong, women weak, men public, women private. But on the steppes, those categories cracked. A woman could be both. The graves whispered it plainly. It wasn't just isolated finds. Across Kazakhstan, Ukraine, southern Russia, archaeologists kept pulling up the same evidence, a chain of kurgans stretching for miles, each one a muted monument to a life lived hard and fast. And the pattern was consistent: women and weapons, over and over, until coincidence was impossible. What if this was the seed of the myth Greek traders saw Scythian riders, fought them, perhaps even lost to them, and when they stumbled home, they explained it in the only way their society could stomach. They weren't real women, they were Amazons. But what if the Greeks, in their arrogance, accidentally preserved a truth they didn't want to admit, that freedom, equality, and resilience had already been lived out on the open steppe? Think of the irony. We treat myths as exaggerations, but sometimes myth is the only trace left of history. Without the Greek stories, perhaps the memory of these warrior women would have vanished into the soil. Without the bones, perhaps the myths would have remained a joke. Together they speak, one tongue of poetry, one tongue of silence, and the harmony between them tells us the Amazons were never just bedtime stories. They were mothers, sisters, daughters who rode into eternity with quivers on their backs. Now imagine the Greeks hearing rumours of these women. A caravan returns from the north, a soldier limps back from a skirmish, and the tales ripple across Athens. We fought them. They were women, but they fought like men. They killed without flinching. The stories spiral, passed from ear to ear, from generation to generation, until they harden into myth. By the time vase painters pick up their brushes, the memories have become monsters. But in the earth, the bones remain stubborn. They tell us something simpler. Something harder. The Amazons were real. Not goddesses, not demons, but women who lived through misery and chose to fight anyway. And isn't that the most human story of all? The Greeks thought they had contained the Amazons in myth, but what happens when the dirt itself drags them back into the light? The steppe was a world without walls. No mountains to shield you, no forest to hide in just a sea of grass stretching into forever, the horizon curving like the back of some ancient beast. Out there, survival meant bending your life to the land, and the Amazons bent harder than most. From the moment a child could stand, she was lifted onto a horse. Not gently, not with lessons spaced across weekends like a modern riding club. Thrown up there, clinging to mane and hide, learning balance by bruising. The horse wasn't just transport, it was a second body, a survival machine stitched to your own. To fall meant more than scraped knees, it meant death trampled, left behind, or devoured by wolves that prowled the edges of camp. Food was never guaranteed. The earth was stingy, the winters merciless. They hunted with bows almost as tall as themselves, pulling sinew strings until their fingers bled, the rawhide cutting grooves into their flesh. They roasted what they caught over open fires, meat blackened with soot, shared with the horses who carried them. The smoke clung to their hair, mixed with sweat and dust, until smell itself became a kind of armour. The Greeks feared them for their weapons, but maybe what made them terrifying was that they had learned to make peace with misery. Think of the cold. Steppe winters drop so low your breath freezes in your beard, your eyelashes crust in ice. The Amazons rode through it wrapped in layers of furs, but nothing truly kept it out. They slept curled against their horses, using their bodies for heat, the animals' ribs rising and falling like a lullaby. And in the morning, they scraped frost from their weapons before they could draw them. Children grew up watching their mothers do this. No weaving in the corner, no silent tending of a hearth. They watched arrows pulled from carcasses, blood washed from saddles, hands hardened by work that men in Athens would have sworn belonged only to them. Imagine what that did to the psyche of a girl. She didn't grow up asking what she could be, she already was. Injury was constant. A horse thrown into a hole, a clash with raiders, a spar gone wrong, bones broke, healed crooked, and life went on. A scar was not shame but proof, each one a line in the story of endurance. There was no illusion of safety, no polite fiction of fragility. Everyone bled, everyone endured. And that endurance, that quiet, relentless grit, was the one thing the Greeks could never paint onto a vase. The steppe wasn't generous with beauty, but the Amazons carried it anyway. They braided their hair with strips of leather, tied amulets to their necks, sometimes painted their faces with ochre before battle. Their horses were decorated too, with bells or dyed cloth, reminders that even in harshness there could be ceremony, even in brutality there could be rhythm. Death was never far. Wolves stalked the camps, rival tribes attacked, sickness came without warning. Burials were quick, but never careless. The body wrapped, the weapons laid close, horses sometimes sacrificed to ride alongside them in the afterlife. And then the camp moved on, the grave left behind like a scar on the land. Imagine being a child watching your mother buried this way, her bow across her chest, her spear at her side. You'd grow knowing that life was short, but legacy was long. That was the lesson the Amazons carried. Death was certain. But how you died could echo forever. The Greeks might have laughed at them as fantasies, but they never lived this cold, this hunger, this endless fight with horizon and sky. The Amazons didn't have to invent resilience. They breathed it. And maybe that's why the Greeks could never erase them, because you can't erase people who've carved resilience into their bones. It's easy to imagine the glamour of myth queens, battles, divine gifts. Harder to picture the nights when horses went lame, when bellies ached from hunger, when frost cracked the skin of their lips. But those nights built the legend more than any duel with Achilles ever could. Because the Amazons weren't forged in poetry, they were forged in hardship. Close your eyes and feel it, the wind whipping against your face, the saddle biting into your thighs, the bowstring humming against your fingers, the taste of smoke in your mouth, the ache of cold in your chest. That was their world. That was their bedtime story, told not in words but in scars and rides that lasted until dawn. And in that world, equality wasn't a philosophy. It wasn't debated in an agora or carved into stone. It was necessity. Women fought because someone had to. Women led because survival demanded it. No speeches, no theory, just the relentless push of life against death, which raises the uncomfortable question if equality was possible on the steppe, born out of necessity. What does it say about the societies that chose to deny it? The Amazons never stepped foot into Athens the way the Persians did, but in art and memory, they were everywhere, on vases, in friezes, etched into temples and whispered in theatre. To the Greeks, they were not just enemies, they were the perfect mirror, twisted and terrifying, reflecting what Athens wanted to deny. Look closely at a red figure vase and you'll see the pattern. The men are always armoured, their shields crested, their helmets shining. The Amazons. They're marked with difference-pointed hats, patterned trousers, exotic boots. Not Greek, never Greek. The message is clear, they must be dressed as outsiders, as barbarians. So the viewer never mistakes them for real women, because if they looked too familiar, if they seemed too close, the illusion would crack. Yet for all that distancing, the artist couldn't help but reveal the struggle. These weren't massacres. The scenes show Amazons locked in duels, their spears poised, their arrows mid-flight. In some cases, you can almost sense the balance tipping their way, as if the painter's hand hesitated to grant Athens the easy win, and that hesitation reveals something raw that beneath the propaganda, there was respect, even fear. The Athenians told themselves stories to manage that fear. Women belonged at the loom, at the hearth, silent in the background. Men fought wars, men debated in the agora, men carved the laws. That was order. But the Amazons made order fragile. They lived a truth Athens refused to admit, that women could do it all, and often better. So how do you kill an idea too dangerous to ignore? You put it in chains of myth. You retell it again and again until the ending is always the same. The Amazons lose, the Greeks win, and male harmony returns. But propaganda leaves fingerprints. Why else carve the Amazonymity into the Parthenon itself, the pride of Athens? Why set in stone an eternal battle between Greeks and women warriors? If victory was certain, if the hierarchy was secure, there'd be no need to immortalize it. The art reveals not confidence, but insecurity, a city obsessed with retelling a fight it never wanted to admit it almost lost. Picture a citizen walking into the Parthenon, the smell of incense thick, the marble glowing in torchlight. His eyes travel up, and there they are, women with bows, women with spears, women knocking men to the ground. He's supposed to see triumph, but doesn't part of him feel unease? Doesn't part of him remember that fear runs both ways, that the same women who fall in stone might have risen in reality? Maybe the Parthenon was less a victory lap than a therapy session, carved in marble to soothe the city's nightmares. There's a darker irony here. Athens worshipped Athena, a goddess of war and wisdom, the very embodiment of balance between strategy and strength. They crowned her as patron, built her temples, prayed for her protection. Yet when faced with flesh and blood women who dared to pick up weapons, they called them monsters. The doublethink is staggering. Praise the female divine, punish the female real. The playwrights added their own twists. In tragedies and comedies, Amazons were sometimes ridiculed, sometimes feared, but never normalized. They had to remain other, always foreign, so the audience could laugh or shudder without questioning the order of their own homes. But the more they appeared on stage, the harder they were to contain, like shadows at the edge of a torch. The more you push them back, the more they flicker. For women sitting in those audiences, if they were even allowed, if they even caught the jokes, what must it have felt like to hear tales of sisters who rode horses, who wielded bows, who led armies? Did they feel envy, or did they tuck it away like a secret bedtime story, one that whispered a different possibility? The Greeks framed Amazons as the anti-Athens, everything their city was not supposed to be. But anti-visions have a way of becoming obsessions. The more they insisted Amazons were alien, the more they carved them into their identity. That's the paradox. They defined themselves not just by who they were, but by who they feared. And in that fear, they kept the Amazons alive longer than any arrow ever could. Think of the psychology again. Men in Athens controlled everything: laws, speech, property, bodies. But in the myths, they kept conjuring women who refused it all. If the Amazons were truly nonsense, why not let them fade? Why repeat them in vase after vase, temple after temple? Because part of them believed, or worse, part of them wished. Even Herodotus, the so-called father of history, couldn't resist weaving them in. He wrote of Scythian tribes where women fought alongside men, where daughters learned the bow, where equality was not a scandal but a fact. He connected them to the Amazons as if to confess, yes, they existed, and yes, we met them. But still, he framed it as exotic, far away, safely distant. Distance was the Greeks' greatest tool. Keep the Amazons on the edges of the map, on the fringes of imagination, and they'll never breach the walls of the city. Yet the art betrayed distance. The Amazons weren't painted in far-off landscapes. They were painted grappling with Greek warriors, on Greek soil, face to face. That proximity mattered. It meant the Greeks couldn't banish them. They had to wrestle them, in clay, in marble, in memory. And that's what makes their propaganda both effective and fragile. Effective because it hammered home a narrative of male victory. Fragile because in depicting the enemy so vividly, they preserved her. And if you preserve something long enough, even as an enemy, you keep the door cracked for her return. The Greeks tried to bury the Amazons under myth, but the effort had the opposite effect. Instead of erasure, they created immortality. And so, when archaeologists dug centuries later, the bones and the myths met like old friends. The soil confirmed what the Greeks had tried to deny. The Amazons were not fantasies, they were flesh. In the end, the Greek gaze was a double-edged sword. They meant to diminish, they ended up immortalizing, they meant to warn, they ended up confessing. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the Amazons never needed Greek art to survive. They lived in their own world, with their own rituals, their own scars, their own resilience, but by fearing them, Athens carved them into history forever. And the fear didn't stop in Athens. It spread east, into Persia, where another empire would meet women who refused to bow, and discover that myths don't stay confined to stories when the battlefield demands proof. Fear carved in Greek stone was one thing, but far from Athens, beyond the Aegean, beyond even the familiar cities of Asia Minor, the Amazons walked out of myth and into the path of empires. And empires, unlike poets, don't deal in imagination, they deal in blood. Herodotus, never shy about a tale that blurred fact and fable, wrote of a queen named Tomyris. She ruled the Massagetae, kin to the Scythians, women who fought with bows and swords, mounted on horses bred for endurance more than grace. When Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, marched east to conquer them, he expected another easy campaign. He had defeated the Medes, the Lydians, the Babylonians. Why should these nomads be different? But the steppe was not Babylon, and Tomyris was not a king. Cyrus sent envoys, promising alliance sealed by marriage, himself as groom, Tomyris as bride. She refused. She didn't need a husband to rule. She didn't need Persia's shadow stretching over her people. Cyrus tried a different tactic. He set a trap. He left a camp stocked with wine, bread, and delicacies, luxuries unknown to the steppe. A detachment of Massagetae stumbled upon it, ate, drank, grew drunk, and were slaughtered by Cyrus's men. Among the dead was Tomyris' son. The grief nearly broke her. But grief on the steppe was never quiet. It sharpened. Tomyris gathered her forces and sent a message to Cyrus. "You are insatiable with blood. Now I will give you your fill." And for once, it wasn't a boast, it was a prophecy. The battle that followed was savage. Steppe riders against the disciplined ranks of Persia, arrows darkening the sky, lances breaking through formations. Imagine the thunder of hooves, the clash of bronze against rawhide, the screams of men unprepared for women who fought with the fury of mothers and sisters, carrying grief like fire in their veins. Cyrus himself fell in that battle, and Tomyris, true to her word, sought his corpse. She severed his head and plunged it into a wineskin filled with blood. "Drink your fill," she spat, "of what you have always craved." The Greeks retold this story with relish, as if to say, "See, even Persia, mighty Persia, could not withstand women of the steppe." But notice how they framed it. Tomyris was always described as savage, cruel, bloodthirsty, rarely as strategic, rarely as just. The truth is more complicated. She matched Cyrus not just in rage, but in cunning. She turned his trick back on him, his arrogance undone by a woman he thought could be bought with marriage. And doesn't that sound familiar? Men trying to rewrite defeat by painting women as monsters. Tomyris wasn't alone. Other accounts tell of Amazon contingents fighting alongside Persian armies, even appearing in battles against Alexander centuries later. To the Greeks, this only deepened the myth. The Amazons weren't just memories on the steppe. They were adversaries in real wars, soldiers who refused to vanish. But let's pause and imagine those battlefields not as chronicles, but as lived moments. A Persian phalanx advancing in tight formation, shields locked. Across from them, women on horseback, their bows bending to breaking point, arrows loosed with the precision of years of practice, dust rising, lungs burning, the sun glaring off bronze. And when the lines crashed together, it wasn't myth colliding with reality. It was reality shattering myth. Men who had scoffed at bedtime stories of warrior women found themselves bleeding out at their hands. And that humiliation, that undeniable physical defeat was what Athens feared most, because it proved the bedtime story was never just a story. The Persians learned it too. Empires crave order. They rely on categories, rulers and ruled, conquerors and conquered. The Amazons cracked those categories open. They showed that women didn't have to stay in tents, didn't have to trail behind armies as captives or concubines. They could be the sharp edge of the spear. That was more dangerous to an empire than any arrow. And maybe that's why the Greeks clung so desperately to their myths of Amazon defeat, because out there, in the dust and blood, the defeats were not always theirs. Other legends ripple from the same time. Stories of Amazon groups sailing across the Black Sea, raiding Greek colonies, striking terror not with numbers but with audacity. They fought not as shadows of men, but as equals, sometimes better. The Greeks had to admit it, even if only in whispers. One fragment describes a duel where a Greek hoplite and an Amazon struck each other down at the same moment, their bodies collapsing side by side, equal in death, if not in myth. What does equality look like on the battlefield? It doesn't look like speeches or decrees. It looks like blood soaking into the same soil, two bodies falling into the same dust. That image, the Amazon and the Greek, dead together, is as much a legacy as any marble frieze. Cyrus's fall wasn't the only tale of Amazon defiance. There were other skirmishes with Scythian men who tried to dominate them, clashes with tribes who underestimated them, even alliances with peoples who recognized their strength. Each story adds a thread, weaving a tapestry not of monsters, but of survivors. And through it all, the Greeks watched, remembered, and twisted. They couldn't erase the reality of Amazon victories, so they reframed them. Tomyris wasn't clever. She was bloodthirsty. Penthesilea wasn't noble. She was tragic. Hippolyta wasn't diplomatic. She was deceived. Every story trimmed or reshaped, bent to fit the hierarchy. But the truth still leaked through, because every time they painted an Amazon, every time they carved one into marble, they admitted she existed. Think of Tomyris again, standing over Cyrus's body. The Persians would call her barbaric. The Greeks would call her savage. But strip the rhetoric away, and what do you see? A leader who refused conquest, a mother who refused erasure, a woman who looked empire in the eye and said no. And maybe that's why her story lingers, because even in defeat, the Amazons gave the world something more dangerous than victory. They gave it memory. The Greeks thought they contained them with bedtime stories. Persia thought it could consume them with conquest. But the Amazons outlasted both. Their echoes carried not in marble or decree, but in the graves that keep surfacing, in the whispers that keep spreading, in the stories we're still telling tonight. And as history moved forward, the Amazons didn't vanish. They travelled slipping into Rome, into medieval chronicles, into every culture that needed a reminder that women with swords never truly disappear. Rome had a way of taking everything it touched and remaking it in marble. Gods, myths, enemies, they all passed through the Roman machine and came out polished, reframed, useful. The Amazons were no different. What had once terrified the Greeks became, in Rome, an ornament. On sarcophagi, you can still see them. Carved in deep relief, women with bows and axes locked in battle with Greeks, Persians, and sometimes indistinct barbarians. Their horses rear, their faces twist in fury, their hair whips across the stone. But these weren't warnings anymore. They were decoration. Wealthy Romans ordered Amazonomachies on their tombs the way someone might choose a favourite motif for wallpaper. And isn't that the cruelest twist of all, when what once frightened you so badly gets reduced to background art to the Greeks? The Amazons had embodied existential dread, the nightmare of women out of place. To the Romans, they were trophies of culture, something to display at dinner parties. A guest might admire the carving on a sarcophagus and murmur, "Ah, the Amazons, those strange warrior women," before sipping wine imported from the very lands where such women had once ridden. But don't mistake this for respect. The Romans admired power, but only when it could be tamed. For them, the Amazon was a symbol of chaos mastered, wildness framed within the borders of empire. Every carving showed the same story: men victorious, women defeated. The art froze the myth at the moment Rome wanted it to stay forever, yet cracks remain even in marble. Look at the expressions. On some sarcophagi, the Amazons don't look vanquished. They look alive, ferocious, mid-strike. One woman leans forward, her spear piercing a man's shield, her body twisting with a vitality that overshadows the rigid posture of her opponent. Even when carved as decoration, the energy of resistance refuses to vanish. And that's the irony: the Romans tried to tame them into ornament, but in doing so, they preserved their defiance. Rome loved the idea of foreign women warriors because they fit neatly into imperial theatre. Exotic enemies made for thrilling spectacles. Amazonomachies appeared in mosaics, in wall paintings, even in stage performances where actors dressed as warrior women clashed for the amusement of crowds. It was safe rebellion packaged and sold. But why this fascination? Why carve these women again and again, long after the wars of Troy were dust and the Scythians were forgotten? The answer lies in Rome's obsession with opposites. To define themselves as rulers of the civilized world, they needed perpetual contrast. Amazons offered that contrast perfectly: female against male, barbarian against Roman, chaos against order. And yet, just as in Greece, fascination betrayed fear. The more Rome displayed them, the more they admitted the image still unsettled. A matron walking past a sarcophagus might feel a shiver. A soldier might glance twice at the figure of a woman swinging an axe into a man's skull. The art may have been propaganda, but art always leaks meaning. Maybe the Romans weren't just decorating their tombs. Maybe they were confessing their nightmares in stone. Consider the timing. Many of these Amazon reliefs appeared during the height of the empire, when Rome stretched from Britain to the Near East. Outwardly confident, inwardly paranoid. Rebellions flared constantly. Enemies pressed at borders. Emperors fell to daggers in the dark. What better metaphor for empire's fragility than a woman supposedly powerless striking down a soldier? The Amazon became a stand-in for everything Rome feared might slip through its iron grip. But Rome, pragmatic as ever, absorbed even that fear. Instead of denying the Amazons, they aestheticized them. They turned battle into beauty, terror into ornament. In doing so, they thought they had disarmed the myth. Yet history has a long memory. The Romans may have wanted the Amazons as mere patterns, but future eyes looked at those carvings and saw something else: possibility. A girl in the 2nd century walking past a mosaic of Amazons might wonder, however fleetingly, what it would feel like to hold a bow. A matron might trace her fingers over the stone and think, why should men alone ride into glory? The Romans thought they were freezing the Amazons into defeat. Instead, they were keeping the ember glowing, waiting for another age to breathe on it. It's worth noting how often the Amazons were linked with death in Roman art. Their battles adorned tombs, their images wrapped sarcophagi. Why, perhaps because they embodied the ultimate paradox: life cut short, power undone, beauty in defiance. To a Roman elite contemplating mortality, what better symbol than women who fought to the end, who went down swinging? But that choice also betrays envy. To die like an Amazon meant to die with fire, not in bed, not quietly. In some twisted way, the Romans used them as inspiration, even as they insisted on their defeat. Look at the language. Roman poets called them ferae, wild beasts, but also praised their courage. They mocked their foreign dress, yet marvelled at their horsemanship. They sneered, and they admired. Contradiction clung to every word, and contradiction, once again, is the hallmark of anxiety. Rome may have believed it had swallowed the world, But the Amazons refused to sit still in its stomach. They kicked, they clawed, they lingered. Every sarcophagus, every mosaic was a quiet admission that empire could decorate its fears, but never kill them. And as Rome carried the myth forward, it carried the seed of a question it could never answer. What if the story wasn't theirs to control? Because the Amazons weren't just Greek fantasies absorbed by Rome. They were real. Their bones still lay in the earth. Their echoes still rode the wind of the steppe. Rome could paint them however it wanted, but history refused to be silenced. And that tension between art and truth, propaganda and memory, is why the Amazons kept riding through the centuries. By the time the empire began to crack, the Amazons had already outlasted its certainty. They moved like ghosts across the edges of maps, always out there, always beyond the next horizon. And when Rome finally crumbled, the stones they left behind carried the images forward. Not of emperors, not of consuls, but of women in trousers and pointed hats, riding into battle long after the artists who carved them were dust. And in the Middle Ages, those ghosts would surface again, reimagined as wonders, impossibilities, lands of women on the fringes of the world. Because no matter how many times empire tried to tame them, the Amazons refused to stay buried. Empires fall, but myths don't. Rome crumbled into dust, its marble fractured, its armies scattered. Yet the Amazons, carved into tombs and whispered in stories, kept riding out of antiquity into the medieval imagination. They survived not in borders or banners, but in echoes. By the Middle Ages, maps were patched together from rumour and scripture, a world half seen and half dreamed. And in the margins of those maps, beyond the reach of known seas, you'd often find a curious label: Regnum Amazonum, the kingdom of the Amazons. Cartographers sketched them as distanty, exotic, living on the far edge of Asia, or tucked somewhere in Africa, a land of women warriors, set apart, unknowable. The myth became geography, stamped onto parchment as though belief could make it true. And isn't that the secret of survival? To slip into the cracks of imagination until no one dares erase you. Medieval chronicles were full of them. Knights heading east on crusade whispered of tribes of women who fought with bows, who lived without men. Marco Polo, spinning his blend of fact and fantasy, described an island of Amazons where women ruled for months of the year, and men only visited briefly to father children. Did he see them? Almost certainly not. But he carried the echo, passing it to an audience hungry for wonders. The Amazons became part of a medieval bestiary of the strange alongside dog-headed men and lands where the sun never set. But unlike those creatures, the Amazons never stayed purely monstrous. They were frightening, yes, but also alluring. Stories described them as beautiful, disciplined, sometimes noble. They weren't just nightmares, they were temptations. Think of the psychology of that. For medieval Europe, locked in rigid hierarchies of lord and vassal, husband and wife, the Amazons offered a fantasy that unsettled and enticed at once, a society where women ruled, where men were secondary, where the world was upside down. To fear that is natural, to secretly crave it, that's what kept the myth alive, because a monster that frightens you fades, but a monster you half desire endures forever. Artists in the Middle Ages painted them into manuscripts, in illuminated margins. Armoured women ride tiny horses, their lances as delicate as quills, on cathedral carvings. You can still glimpse them frozen in stone, shooting arrows into beasts or duelling with knights. The church tolerated them as allegory women outside God's order, punished for stepping beyond their role. But viewers still saw the power in the lines, the strength in the faces. The allegory might condemn, but the image whispered another story. In some tales, Amazons became almost chivalric. They weren't enemies to be mocked, they were rivals worthy of knights. Legends spread of Sir Galahad or Alexander the Great encountering Amazon queens, dueling them, sometimes sparing them out of admiration. These weren't defeats meant to reassure, they were encounters meant to fascinate. And fascination is more dangerous than fear, because fascination keeps you awake at night. As Europe stumbled toward the age of exploration, the echo grew louder. Sailors told stories of islands ruled by women, of coasts where men were absent, of strange tribes glimpsed from the decks of caravels. When Spanish conquistadors hacked their way into the New World, they swore they found Amazons along the Great River. The name stuck, the Amazon River, christened after women who may never have been there, but whose legend was too powerful to resist. That's how far the echo carried from Scythian graves to South American jungles, from Homer's verses to maps that tried to draw the edge of the world. But why? Why did the myth refuse to die when so many others faded into dust? Perhaps because the Amazons weren't just a story about women. They were a story about possibility. Every age retold them differently, but every retelling betrayed the same anxiety. What if the order of things could be overturned? What if women didn't stay silent? What if the roles reversed? Every retelling was a nervous laugh, a whispered confession, a glimpse of a world just out of reach. By the Renaissance, writers wrapped them in classical robes again. Scholars rediscovered Herodotus, Plutarch, and Apollodorus. Painters filled canvases with Amazonomachyes, not as propaganda, but as spectacle battles staged like operas, bodies twisting in colour and motion. The Amazons became muses as much as enemies, fueling the imagination of a Europe trying to reconcile ancient glory with modern ambition. And yet the core never changed. Always women in arms, always riding against the tide, always falling and yet never erased. That cycle, the endless defeat, the endless resurrection, was the real heartbeat of the myth. Think of it every time a man carved, painted, or wrote an Amazon. He meant to cage her, but the act of creation freed her again. Each stroke of the brush was also a resurrection. Each line of poetry was also a breath. The Amazons endured not because they won on the battlefield, but because they won in memory. And sometimes memory is the sharper weapon, the one no empire can blunt. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, skeptics sneered at them as quaint, another relic of primitive imagination. But even then, travellers kept finding bones in the steppe, women buried with weapons, the echo of a truth that wouldn't stay buried. The myth had always been a mask laid over reality, and reality has a way of bleeding through. That's why we still whisper their name tonight. Because the Amazons aren't just Greek mythology anymore. They're medieval marvels, Renaissance muses, explorers' rumours, echoes stretching across centuries. Their story bends, breaks, reforms, but never vanishes. And if they refuse to disappear through antiquity, through Rome, through the Middle Ages, then what happens when the modern world rediscovers them? Do they remain bedtime stories, or do they rise again, in uniforms, in cockpits, in battlefields that belong not to myth, but to us? The Amazons were never just about horses and arrows. They were about fear. Fear is the shadow that trails every myth, the unspoken thing behind the story, the pressure building behind the words. And if we strip the legends down to their bones, what we're left with isn't just women fighting men, it's men fighting themselves. The Greeks said antianeri, those who stand against men, but listen closely. That phrase doesn't only describe women with weapons, it describes an insecurity men imagining a force strong enough to match them, to oppose them, to reflect their violence back at them. And why imagine it at all? Unless some part of you believes it's possible, the Amazons were less a story about women and more a mirror held up to men. Let's sit with that for a moment. In Athens, men controlled almost everything: politics, courts, war, speech. Women lived largely in the shadows, excluded from public life, their names barely recorded, by rights. There should have been no fear. If the system was so stable, why conjure nightmares of women marching into the city, bows drawn? Why carve them into temples as eternal enemies? Because the control was never as complete as it seemed. The tighter you grip, the more you fear what might slip through your fingers. The Amazons were that fear, crystallized, and fear, when repressed, tends to mutate. It doesn't vanish, it leaks into dreams, into myths, into bedtime stories that leave children both thrilled and unsettled. That's why Greek fathers told their sons of Heracles and Hippolyta, of Theseus and Antiope, of Achilles and Penthesilea. The stories reassured women can fight, but men always win. And yet the very need to repeat that victory betrayed doubt. It's like whistling in the dark. You don't sing if you're not afraid. The Amazons were a lullaby for men, but one that never let them sleep soundly. Consider how often the myths pivot on betrayal, misunderstanding, or accident. Hippolyta offers peace, only to be killed when Hera spreads lies. Antiope falls for Theseus, only to be dragged into war. Penthesilea seeks redemption, only to die in a duel she almost wins. These aren't clean victories, they're messy, haunted, filled with second guesses. The myths can't help but admit that the Amazons came close enough to unsettle, close enough to linger. That lingering is the psychological legacy. Fear of reversal. That's the core. The Greeks defined themselves by hierarchy, men above women, Greeks above barbarians, order above chaos. The Amazons flipped the script. Women ruled, men were marginalized. Society carried on anyway. That reversal was terrifying because it was plausible. The Greeks met Scythian women on horseback. They saw tribes where daughters rode and fought. The myth grew not from fantasy but from contact. And so every Amazon story carried a whisper. What if our order isn't natural? What if it's just fragile? And fragility is a harder enemy than chaos, because fragility means the threat lives inside you. Think about Achilles staring at Penthesileia's face. Why did that moment shake him? Not because she was monstrous, but because she was human brave, beautiful, noble. He recognized her as equal too late, and that recognition nearly broke him. The myth preserves that recognition like a guilty secret. Even the strongest man in Greece could be pierced by the idea of equality. Now extend that secret to a whole culture. Athens needed the Amazons to lose, but they couldn't erase the memory of women who fought well, who fought fiercely, who almost won, and that almost gnawed at them. There's another layer: desire. Fear and desire are twins more often than enemies. The Amazons were painted as exotic, alluring, strange. They wore trousers, rode horses, carried weapons. To Greek men, they were terrifying but also intoxicating. What happens when the thing you most fear is also the thing you most want? You build myths that oscillate between condemnation and fascination. Look at the stories. Heracles doesn't just kill Hippolyta, he seduces her first, or at least wins her trust. Theseus doesn't just defeat Antiope, he marries her. Achilles doesn't just slay Penthesileia, he falls in love with her dying eyes. Every Amazon myth bends toward intimacy. The line between enemy and lover blurs, until the myths look less like conquest and more like confession. The Greeks couldn't decide if the Amazons were nightmares or fantasies, so they made them both. And isn't that the essence of repression? You can't embrace, so you vilify. You can't admit attraction, so you paint it as danger. But by painting it, you preserve it. The Amazons lived rent-free in the Greek imagination not because they were monsters, but because they were irresistible. But fear and desire weren't just private. They were political. Myths do cultural work. They tell people how to behave, what to fear, what to reject. By retelling Amazon tales, the Greeks reinforced male dominance. See, the stories said, when women rule, chaos follows. When women fight, disaster comes. Only when men restore order does the world make sense again. Yet even as propaganda, the stories wobble. If the point was to erase the Amazons, why give them names? Why make them queens with histories, motives, and tragedies? Why not reduce them to nameless beasts, like harpies or gorgons? The answer is simple: they couldn't. The Amazons were too real, too close, too haunting. The Greeks couldn't erase the Amazons because deep down, they believed in them, and belief, once planted, spreads. Rome inherited the fear, turned it into decoration. The Middle Ages reframed it as wonder, placing Amazons on maps. The Renaissance painted them in oil. Renaissance men secretly fascinated by women who wielded power. Each retelling kept the fear alive, but each retelling also kept the possibility alive. Let's push deeper. What does this tell us about the human mind? Myths reveal not just events, but anxieties. The Amazon myth reveals 3: fear of disorder, that society's rules could be upended; fear of equality, that strength is not male by default; fear of desire, that the boundaries between dominance and attraction are porous. These fears weren't unique to Greece. They pulse through cultures across time. When men in Rome carved Amazons into tombs, they were confessing the same unease. When medieval scribes placed Amazons at the edge of maps, they were projecting the same dread. When conquistadors named the Amazon River, they were reenacting the same anxiety that somewhere out there, women could fight and win. And maybe that's why the Amazons still haunt us, because the fear they embodied never really left. Even today, echoes remain. Stories of women in combat, of female leaders, of equality in domains once thought male all stir the same blend of fascination and backlash. Every argument about whether women belong in armies, whether they can lead nations, whether they can handle power, it's the Amazon myth, retold in modern clothes. The Greeks never solved their anxiety. They only buried it in story. And maybe we haven't solved it either. Now, let's ground this with something concrete. Archaeology doesn't just confirm women fought, it shows how deeply they were integrated. Graves reveal young girls buried with bows, older women with battle scars healed long before death. These weren't exceptions, they were patterns. Societies existed where women's strength was normalized, not demonized. For the Greeks, this was unbearable. It proved their hierarchy wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable. It was just one way to arrange the world. The Amazon myth is their nervous response, their whispered prayer, please let it not be true. But the dirt answered back. It was true. And once you know it's true, the myth stops being reassurance and starts being confession. Consider one last irony. The Greeks worshipped Athena, a goddess of war, wisdom, strategy. They crowned her as their protector, built her a temple on the Acropolis, called her their patron. They prayed to a woman warrior even as they condemned women warriors. That contradiction is the heart of their psychology. They wanted the strength of the feminine divine, but not the strength of the feminine human. Athena was safe. She was eternal, controllable, a symbol. Flesh and blood Amazons were dangerous. They lived, they bled, they proved the categories false, and so the Greeks split themselves. They adored the idea of a female god who fought, but demonized the reality of female humans who did the same. That split runs like a fault line through their culture and through ours. The Amazons were never just a myth. They were a mirror, and the Greeks flinched every time they looked. The Middle Ages inherited the ghosts of the ancient world, but they didn't keep them in marble temples. They pushed them to the edges of the map, into margins where fantasy and fear thrived. And there, riding alongside dog-headed men and lands of endless night, the Amazons survived not as myth Greece had confined, but as wonders still wandering. In illuminated manuscripts, monks inked them into borders of sacred texts. There they are, women in pointed helmets, tiny in scale, but fierce, aiming arrows at demons or jousting with knights no larger than the letters they decorate. To a reader by candlelight, the message was half warning, half lure. Yes, these women existed somewhere, but they weren't to be trusted. They were curiosities, reminders of the world beyond Christendom's fragile order. The Middle Ages were built on fear of the unknown, and the Amazons became shorthand for that unknown, the alluring, the terrifying, the almost believable. Travellers' tales carried them farther. Crusaders spoke of tribes of women who fought like lions in the deserts. Pilgrims whispered of kingdoms ruled entirely by queens, hidden past mountains no one had crossed. The more remote the land, the louder the Amazon echoes grew. Marco Polo described an island where women ruled for most of the year, receiving men only briefly, then sending them away. He probably never saw such a place. But his readers wanted it to exist. They wanted to believe that at the edges of the world. Order flipped upside down. It wasn't just fear, it was hunger. Medieval Europe was hungry for wonders, in a world where daily life was brutal, monotonous, bound by feudal chains. The imagination fed on marvels, and the Amazons, with their mix of danger and beauty, discipline and seduction, were perfect fodder. But the church framed them carefully. In sermons, Amazons were cautionary tales. They represented women who stepped outside God's plan, who usurped men's roles, who turned society upside down. Preachers thundered, "See what happens when women rule chaos? Death, disorder." But here's the catch: to preach them was to keep them alive. Every time a sermon warned against the Amazons, it conjured them again in listeners' minds. The louder the condemnation, the sharper the image became. And so, the Amazons haunted medieval minds, not only as enemies, but as fantasies. Knights' romances sometimes cast them as worthy rivals, women who could match a knight's courage, sometimes even win his heart. In one French tale, a knight faces an Amazon queen in single combat. Instead of slaying her, he spares her. She, in turn, admires his mercy. And the story ends not with conquest, but with mutual recognition. This wasn't just propaganda, it was curiosity, a flicker of admiration in a world that officially denied women such power. That contradiction is the hallmark of the medieval Amazon. They were condemned and desired, feared and fantasized, laughed at and respected. Every appearance carried tension, like a dream you can't quite shake, but maps tell the story best. Medieval cartographers often filled blank spaces with monsters and marvels, and again you see the words Regnum Amazonum, the kingdom of the Amazons, sometimes in Asia, sometimes Africa, sometimes drifting like a mirage wherever the parchment left room. The message was clear: we don't know what's out there, but we're sure women with bows are waiting. Picture a scholar bent over a desk, quill scratching, ink staining his fingers. He draws mountains, rivers, seas, and in the far corner, tiny figures of women on horseback, bows drawn. To him, it wasn't fantasy, it was precaution. The world was vast, God's creation immense, and who was he to say the Amazons weren't still riding beyond the next horizon? The mapmakers kept the Amazons alive not because they knew them, but because they couldn't bear to erase them. The Renaissance carried the echo forward. Scholars rediscovered Herodotus and Plutarch, retelling Amazon myths with fresh ink, fresh ore. Artists painted Amazonomachies with oil and canvas instead of chisels, filling salons with colour and chaos. Suddenly, the Amazons weren't monsters, they were muses. Painters lavished attention on their armour, their horses, their flowing hair. Patrons commissioned the scenes to show off not just wealth, but sophistication. To know the Amazons was to know antiquity. But here, too, the contradiction deepened. Renaissance humanists celebrated reason, balance, order. Yet their canvases kept overflowing with women warriors who refused that order. It was as if the closer Europe came to modernity, the more it needed the Amazons as counterweight. They were the reminder that reason has shadows, that order breeds its own unrest. And in the age of reason, the Amazons became the embodiment of what reason tried hardest to deny: passion, defiance, equality. The age of exploration made the echo louder still. Spanish conquistadors, hacking their way through South American jungles, swore they fought women warriors along the Great River. They claimed these women shot arrows from the trees, ambushed them, vanished into the green. Whether true or not, the name stuck. The Amazon River named not for its endless sweep of water, but for women warriors Europe couldn't stop dreaming about. Think about that. A river longer than a continent, carrying a name born of myth. Because men in steel armour thought they glimpsed the ghost of Greek stories in the New World. That's the scale of the Amazons' endurance from Scythian graves to South American maps. Their legend rode continents, and once named, the river carried the story onward. Every ship that sailed it repeated the myth. Every chart that marked it whispered again, "Here be Amazons." Even where they never lived, they lived anyway. But the echo wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was weaponized. Explorers used the Amazon myth to justify conquest sea. Even women fighters here so wild, so untamed. This land must be subdued. The legend became part of Europe's colonial gaze, a way to frame the unfamiliar as exotic, dangerous, in need of control. The same contradiction as Athens, recycled fascination mixed with domination. Yet every retelling, even exploitative ones, portrayed the same obsession. The Amazons refused to die. They slipped into every century, every culture that needed them, a knight's rival, a map's marvel, a river's name, a colonial excuse, always changing shape, always recognizable. And maybe that's the secret of immortality, not to stay the same, but to haunt every age in the form it most fears. By the Enlightenment, skepticism grew. Rationalists scoffed at dog-headed men, at lands of eternal twilight, but even they hesitated with the Amazons. Reports of Scythian graves trickled in, women with weapons buried in the earth. Suddenly the bedtime story didn't seem so childish. The myth bent but didn't break. Enlightened minds called it history distorted, fact exaggerated. But the whisper remained maybe, just maybe. They were real. And isn't that the psychological core every age tried to decide what the Amazons meant? But none erased them. They were too useful, too flexible, too haunting From medieval monks to Renaissance painters, from conquistadors on jungle rivers to Enlightenment skeptics in libraries, the Amazons kept returning, sometimes enemies, sometimes muses, sometimes excuses, but always present. The Greeks thought they had killed them in myth. Rome thought it had tamed them in marble. The Middle Ages thought it had confined them to margins. The New World thought it had baptized them in rivers, but the Amazons refused every cage. And tonight, their echo is still here, an old story. Yes, but not just old. A story that refuses to be buried, that resurfaces whenever fear and fascination collide. The Renaissance didn't just repaint the Amazons, it reimagined them. In courts across Europe, queens and noblewomen began to lean into the image, sometimes consciously. Elizabeth of England styled herself as a virgin queen, untouched, untamed, wielding power like a warrior in her own right. Pamphlets whispered comparisons. Was she not an Amazon of her time, standing against Spain, commanding fleets, holding her ground in a world of kings? It wasn't just myth anymore, it was metaphor. To call a woman an Amazon was no longer insult alone. It was prophecy. Literature followed suit. In French epics and Italian romances, Amazons appear not just as foes but as heroines. Ariosto's Orlando Furioso tells of Bradamante, a knightly woman whose swordsmanship rivals any man's, whose loyalty and love are tested across wild adventures. She wasn't called Amazon outright, but the shadow lingered. Every female knight, every warrior queen, every woman in armor carried the old echo. The myth seeped into archetypes, shape-shifting so smoothly that readers didn't always notice. Painters, too, embraced the spectacle. Rubens painted Amazonomachies with tumbling bodies, horses screaming, chaos rendered in lush oils. His canvases filled with heat, muscles, motion, but look closely. The women aren't caricatures. They're fierce, alive, their expressions charged with anger or grief. Even when depicted in defeat, they dominate the viewer's gaze. The men blur into the melee, but the Amazons command attention. The art meant to show their destruction, instead preserved their defiance. And Europe couldn't let them go. Explorers carried their names further than ever. Jesuit missionaries in South America insisted tribes told them of women warriors who lived apart from men. They pointed upriver, to valleys no European had seen, and swore the Amazons lived there. Whether the tribes invented the story to satisfy foreign curiosity, or whether Europeans heard only what they wanted, the effect was the same. The Amazon River bore the name, and the myth spread across oceans. Consider the symbolism. A river that swallows tributaries, that floods, that resists conquest. It was natural that Europeans saw Amazons in its currents. They weren't naming geography. They were naming fear, naming desire, naming the story they couldn't kill, a continent away. And still the Greeks' bedtime story rode the waves. By the 17th century, Amazons had become a paradox. Scholars argued over their existence. Some insisted they were allegories, metaphors for wild lands or untamed passions. Others cited bones, artifacts, rumours, maps, and argued they must have been real. Coffee houses in London buzzed with debate were Amazons proof of human diversity or proof of human imagination, but outside the halls of scholars, ordinary people kept telling the tales. Folk stories in Eastern Europe described villages of women who rode at night, punishing cruel husbands, stealing into towns to fight injustice. In Russia, Cossack soldiers claimed to battle female riders across the steppes. Each story blurred truth and fantasy, but none let the Amazons vanish. The question was never whether they existed. It was why people needed them to exist. Because myths that endure aren't just entertainment. They're medicine, they're mirrors, they're weapons. The Amazons served all three. For rulers, they were propaganda. For artists, they were muses. For ordinary people, they were proof that another life might be possible, one where roles bent, where categories broke, where women could stand unbowed. And that's why the echo swelled into the Enlightenment. Even as rationalists dismissed monsters and miracles, the Amazon persisted. Voltaire sneered at many myths, but even he toyed with the idea of Amazon societies. Rousseau, wrestling with ideas of nature and civilization, referenced them as symbols of raw human vigor. They were too useful, too adaptable, too haunting to discard. Enlightenment stripped away dragons and unicorns. But the Amazons survived the purge. The 18th century even romanticized them. Operas featured Amazon queens as tragic heroines, torn between love and duty, caught in the clash of sword and song. In salons, portraits of noble women sometimes included subtle Amazonian touches, helmets, bows, military stances, flirtations with power wrapped in velvet. To call a woman Amazon was no longer purely insult. It could also be admiration, a nod to strength unsoftened by society. By the 19th century, the myth bent again. Victorian writers, obsessed with gender roles, used Amazons both as warnings and as fantasies. Adventure novels described tribes of fierce women in Africa, in Asia, in distant lands where imagination could still run wild. At the same time, suffragists embraced the Amazon as a badge of honour. Pamphlets depicted women as modern Penthesilaias, fighting not with spears but with petitions, not against Greeks, but against parliaments. The Amazons had moved from bedtime story to battle cry. And archaeology was catching up. In the 1860s, Russian excavations began uncovering more graves with women buried beside weapons. The whispers hardened into evidence. The bedtime story was cracking open into history. Imagine the shock of Victorians so certain of rigid gender roles when faced with proof that warrior women had truly lived. Some denied it, insisting the weapons were ceremonial. Others embraced it, seeing in the bones a vindication of ancient legend. Either way, the Amazons refused to stay confined to imagination. They had re-entered reality, and once myth bleeds into fact, it can't be erased. From Homer's verses to Scythian graves to Victorian trenches, the Amazons had ridden every age, wearing every mask, answering every fear. What does this tell us? That myths don't survive because they're true or false. They survive because they're needed. And the Amazon myth was always needed by Greeks who feared reversal, by Romans who decorated defeat, by medieval monks who warned against temptation, by explorers who craved marvels, by suffragists who demanded strength, by archaeologists who found bones whispering in the dirt. The Amazons didn't just outlive antiquity, they infected history, bending to every century's needs, never letting themselves be buried. And if they've survived this long, who's to say they're finished? Because the echo of chapter 13 isn't an ending, it's a drumbeat carrying us into the modern world, where Amazons would appear again, not on horseback, not with bows, but in plains, in uniforms, in comic books, in every place where women refuse silence. The Amazons didn't stay trapped in marble or medieval margins. They rode forward, carried not by horses but by history itself. Every age that thought it had buried them ended up needing them again. And the modern world, despite its machines, its science, its certainty, was no different. Because myths don't die, they adapt. When the 20th century cracked open with its wars and revolutions, the Amazon returned not as bedtime story but as flesh and blood. The trenches of World War I, the resistance networks of World War II, the guerrilla fighters of every revolution since each saw women step into roles once deemed impossible. And every time, someone whispered the same word, Amazons. Take the Soviet Union. In World War II, Germany called the Eastern Front the most brutal theatre in history. Millions died, whole cities starved, entire armies froze, and into that firestorm rode the Night Witches. That's what the Germans called them, female pilots of the 508th Night Bomber Regiment. They flew flimsy wooden planes, crop dusters really, with canvas stretched over frames. They cut their engines before diving, gliding silently through the dark, then dropping bombs on German camps. The sound of their planes slicing the night terrified soldiers. Nachthexen, they called them Night Witches. But witches, Amazons, it's the same projection. Women who fought outside the script became supernatural. The Germans couldn't admit they were being outflown by teenagers in plywood biplanes, so they turned them into monsters. The truth was simpler and sharper. Those girls were brave, relentless, and human. They flew up to 15 missions a night, navigating by stopwatch and stars, wrapped in the same grit that once carried Scythian riders across the steppe. Strip away the centuries, and the echoes clear. The Amazons never left. They just traded horses for wings, and they weren't alone. Soviet snipers, many of them women, became legends. Lyudmila Pavlichenko killed over 300 enemy soldiers, so many that Hitler himself supposedly cursed her name. American journalists later dubbed her Lady Death. To her enemies, she was something unnatural, inhuman. To her allies, she was proof that women could fight with patience, discipline, deadliness, everything men had claimed for themselves. It's no coincidence she was called Amazon in Western papers. The label resurfaced because history needed it again. Whenever women refused silence in battle, cultures reached for the same ancient word. It was shorthand for fear, admiration, contradiction. Every bullet she fired was an arrow loosed from the past. Resistance movements echoed it too. In occupied France, women ran underground networks, smuggled messages, sabotaged trains. In Yugoslavia and Greece, they fought as partisans, rifles slung across their shoulders, trudging through mountains, hunted and hunting. Men wrote them off as exceptions, marvels, but exceptions, when they repeat across centuries, stop being exceptions. They become patterns, and the pattern was ancient. From Penthesilea to Pavlichenko, from Hippolyta's girdle to Soviet uniforms, the shape holds women who stand outside the script, who prove that categories are fragile. The 20th century didn't just see Amazons in war, it saw them in art. The most famous was draped not in armour, but in Starr's Wonder Woman, created in 1941 by William Moulton Marston. She was born from Themyscira, a mythical Amazon island. Marston himself, fascinated by psychology, polygraphs, and women's liberation, crafted her as both hero and message. She wasn't sidekick or ornament, she was the main event. And for the first time in millennia, the Amazons stepped not from marble, but from comic panels. Wonder Woman was no accident. She emerged during a world at war, when women were filling factories, driving ambulances, flying planes. Society needed a symbol, and Marston gave them one. She fought Nazis on the page while women fought patriarchy off it. And though her costume was stylized, almost playful, her roots ran deep. She carried Hippolyta's name. She came from a society of women warriors, and she embodied the echo that had never died. Yet even in fiction, the contradictions remained. Some readers saw her as empowerment, others as threat, others as fantasy. She was admired, mocked, sexualized, revered exactly what had happened to the Amazons for centuries. The myth bent again, reshaped for modern eyes, carrying the same unresolved tension. The Amazons were no longer bedtime stories, they were Saturday morning heroes, and still, the real-world echoes piled up. During Vietnam, women fought in guerrilla forces or in the Middle East. Kurdish women's units became symbols of defiance against ISIS, their presence so feared that jihadists believed dying at a woman's hand would rob them of paradise. Imagine that myths thousands of years old, still terrifying men in trenches today. History keeps circling. The battlefield changes spears to rifles, horses to planes, but the psychological script doesn't. Men confronted with armed women reach for the same vocabulary. Amazons, witches, monsters, anything but equal, anything but human. Because to call them human is to admit the hierarchy was never natural. But the psychological legacy didn't stay on the battlefield. It seeped into culture, politics, everyday life. In the 1960s and 70s, as women's liberation movements surged, critics and supporters alike used the word Amazon. To some, it meant defiance, strength, courage. To others, it meant threat, emasculation, chaos. The same word split in two, carrying centuries of contradiction. And here's the twist: many women embraced it. What had once been insult became armor. To be called Amazon was no longer shame, it was pride. Protesters carried banners with Amazon symbols. Artists reimagined them in paintings and performances. Writers used the myth to challenge patriarchy. Once again, the story slipped the leash. The Greeks had meant Amazons as warnings. Modern women turned them into role models. Even the name carried weight. When Jeff Bezos built his empire of commerce, what did he call it? Amazon. Not Nile, not Yangtze, not Mississippi. Amazon, because the name still resonated: immensity, power, unstoppable force. It's telling that the world's largest river and one of the world's largest companies share the same label, both tapping into the myth of something vast, female-coded and feared. Of course, the irony is sharp. The company has nothing to do with warrior women, but the choice proves the word still carries awe. It lingers in the imagination like a drumbeat. So what's the through line? It's simple. Every time history tries to silence women who fight, the Amazon rides again. In graves, in myths, in resistance cells, in comic books, in corporations, the echo refuses to vanish. And maybe the most unsettling part is this: we still haven't resolved the contradiction. The world continues to argue whether women belong in combat, in power, in leadership. Each argument replays the old anxiety: what if order isn't natural? What if strength isn't male by default? What if the bedtime story was never just a story? The Amazons survive because the question survives. So the modern legacy isn't just about Wonder Woman or night witches. It's about the deeper truth myths are never buried. They're recycled, reframed, resurrected because the fears and desires that birthed them never leave us. And that's why tonight, whispering across centuries, the Amazons still ride. The Amazons were never meant to last. At least, not in the way the Greeks told it. Every story ended with their defeat, Heracles cutting down Hippolyta, Theseus dragging Antiope, Achilles burying his blade in Penthesilea. The myth promised closure, women out of place destroyed, order restored, men triumphant. And yet here we are, still speaking their names: Hippolyta, Penthesilea, Antiope, Tomyris. Names carved in fragments of pottery, whispered in chronicles, etched into rivers, painted into comic panels. Their defeats were never the end. They were beginnings disguised as endings, seeds buried in blood that kept sprouting again and again. The Greeks thought the Amazons were their shadow. It turns out the Amazons were our reflection. Because what's lasted isn't the stories of defeat. It's the contradictions those stories tried to hide. The fragility of male power. The allure of strength wrapped in femininity. The possibility that societies could be built differently, that roles could bend, that hierarchy wasn't destiny. The Amazons lived not in victories or losses, but in questions that never stopped haunting us. Think of how myths usually die. The harpies, the satyrs, the sphinx, they fade into allegory, into folklore, into footnotes. But the Amazons refused. They slipped out of antiquity, marched through Rome, whispered through medieval maps, crossed oceans into South American rivers, flew as night witches, wore stars on their costume in comic books. They survived because they weren't really myths at all. They were human possibilities that cultures kept trying to bury and failing. You can kill a character, you can't kill a question, and that's the legacy. The Amazons embody not answers, but questions we still wrestle with. What is power? Who gets to wield it? Who decides what's natural? Every society that retold their story was really wrestling with itself. The Greeks used them to police gender roles. The Romans used them as decoration to soothe imperial anxiety. Medieval Europe used them as warnings and wonders. The Enlightenment used them as puzzles. The modern world used them as metaphors, icons, heroines. Each retelling was less about the Amazons and more about the people doing the telling. The Amazons are a mirror we can't stop looking into even when the reflection frightens us. But here's the twist. For all the violence in their myths, for all the blood spilled in battlefields and burial mounds, the Amazons' greatest legacy isn't destruction, it's resilience. They remind us that strength can come from places society tries to silence. They remind us that every hierarchy, no matter how rigid, has cracks. They remind us that endurance sometimes means simply refusing to vanish. Think about the Scythian girl buried with her bow, 16 years old, her bones scarred from riding, her quiver still full of arrows. She didn't live to see old age, but she lived enough to prove the story wasn't fantasy. And her bones whispered across millennia, "I was here." Think about Penthesilea's last glance at Achilles, a look so piercing that even he, slayer of Hector, breaker of men, staggered with love and regret. A look that outlived his rage, outlived the war, outlived the very city they fought over. Troy burned to ash, but her gaze is still remembered. Think about Tomyris holding Cyrus's severed head, dropping it into a wineskin of blood. That image terrified empires, not because it was savage, but because it was honest. She gave him exactly what he craved, and in doing so proved that conquest has limits, that arrogance has consequences. Legacies aren't measured in victories, they're measured in echoes. The modern echoes are everywhere if you listen. A woman in fatigues, standing in a desert outpost, rifle slung across her shoulder. a protester holding a sign that reads Amazon not as insult, but as identity. A little girl watching Wonder Woman and whispering to herself, I could be that. These aren't fantasies, they're continuations, because in the end, the Amazons aren't really gone. They live in every woman who refuses silence, in every challenge to hierarchy, in every reminder that power isn't one gender's birthright. The Amazons never needed to win, they only needed to endure. And that brings us back to the quiet place where the story rests tonight. Because this isn't just history, it's a bedtime story, the kind that doesn't tuck you in with answers, but lets you drift off with questions still humming in your head. Picture the campfires on the steppe, flames licking against the dark, women polishing arrows, horses nickering nearby. Picture the halls of Athens, men whispering uneasily about women who ride and fight. Picture the jungle, the river that swallowed Europe's imagination, christened with their name. Picture the skies above Stalingrad, the night witches cutting through the dark, engines silent, bombs falling like whispers of old myths reborn. They're all the same story, the same pulse, the same question we still can't put to rest. And maybe that's why the Amazons belong here, in a bedtime history. Because they've always been half dream, half truth. Because they've always been told with a shiver. Because they've always lived in that liminal space between nightmare and fantasy, between fear and longing, between what is and what might be. The Amazons remind us that every society is only one story away from rewriting itself. So tonight, as the lights dim and the hum of the world softens, let the Amazons ride through your thoughts, not as monsters, not as fantasies, but as questions. Let Hippolyta walk beside you, her belt gleaming with choice. Let Antiope ride past, her loyalty tearing two worlds apart. Let Penthesilea meet your gaze, her eyes fierce and tender in the same breath. Let Tamira stand tall, bloodied and unbroken, proof that no empire lasts forever. And as you drift, remember their story isn't just theirs, it's ours, because the Amazons weren't a chapter in history. They were the margin notes, the footnotes, the hidden text beneath the main script, whispering that another world is possible, and maybe, just maybe, that's the real reason they've survived. Not because they were defeated, not because they were monsters, not even because they were real, but because they've always been necessary. Myths don't endure because they're true, they endure because they're needed, and we still need the Amazons.